Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Ashutosh Bhardwaj, a journalist, a writer, an author. In fact, we are former colleagues at the Indian Express. Ashutosh, welcome to The Print, and it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you, Jyoti. Wonderful to see you here as well.
And of course, the reason we are here, Ashutosh, is because The Print is launching your book online. So here is a covered copy of your book. If you want, you can show it to the viewers of this program. It's called The Death Script. And you don't have a covered copy, but mine is. So I'm just going to open it now. Here it is. So here is the online launch of The Death Script by Ashutosh Bhardwaj by The Print in collaboration with HarperCollins. This is our new venture called Soft Cover. And Ashutosh, you're one of the first whose books is being launched, and we're very happy about that. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. It's a privilege for me as well that this book was conceived when Shekhar Gupta was the editor-in-chief at Express. So this book is now being launched from The Print.
Thanks.
It's a coincidence from my side as well.
So just to start this conversation, Ashutosh, it's such a movingly written, very, very eloquent report actually of your years in Chhattisgarh and the story of the jungle, as it were. And you have so many characters. You have the Maoists, you have the surrendered Maoists, you have the informers, and you have the police, and just generally people. So my first question to you is, what is your book about? And the name, The Death Script, that's an odd name for a book, isn't it?
Well, I believe I couldn't have a different title for this. The reason being, there are two reasons perhaps. One is the Dandakaranya, the theatre of the police-Maoist conflict where the book is located in.
Yeah.
That is perhaps one of the largest graveyards that the independent India has created and nourished over the last 40 or 50 years. Mm-hmm. So any outsider, whosoever steps in Dandakaranya, death is the first reality that person witnesses. On a more personal level, when I went to Chhattisgarh and started reporting on these deaths, I had witnessed just one death in my entire life before that. Just one body I had seen of a close relative. So imagine a young reporter who goes to Chhattisgarh and who starts witnessing one body after another. So then this conversation with these deceased became a part of, if not a journalistic exercise, but an exercise which was overwhelming as well as very humbling. So they could not even...
Stop you right now. The conversation with the deceased.
Yeah.
So just to tell our viewers that in this book, in Ashutosh's book, there's a conversation that the protagonist or the writer of the book has with several people who have been killed. So go ahead.
See, in this book, if you see the chapter, the first chapter begins with a deceased Maoist.
Yeah.
So he comes to narrate his story. A few chapters later, a young girl who was raped and killed by the police forces, she comes to narrate his story. So when I wrote the earliest chapters of this book, these were written in first-person perspective, like from the narrator's perspective. But in the subsequent drafts, I realized that this conversation perhaps remains incomplete unless I give the voice to them, unless I make them the narrators of their own story. So this then becomes a part of my own conversation with them.
So that's a literary device that you use of the narrator who's meeting, who's conversing with people who are already dead. But these four kinds of people that you have in your book, the living Maoists, the dead Maoists, the surrendered or informers, as well as the police. Tell us a little bit about them, about each of them.
About these people who I've written about? See, I met a large cross-section of people during my reporting years there. And almost everybody made me question my beliefs. For instance, I was with full of questions when I would visit any police officer or any Maoist. But when I would return with notes in my diaries, I would realize that I have more questions for my own sense, my own perceptions, my own prejudices and preferences than I had for them. So these people, like Adivasis, for instance, when I went to visit Adivasis, I was largely governed by a sense which perhaps a lot of English speaking urban Indians have. The Adivasis live beyond the pales of civilization. And as V.S. Naipaul very famously or infamously said about them, they are stunted species. But when I conversed with them, when I lived with them, I realized that this is a different culture, different civilization altogether. They cannot be interpreted, cannot be analyzed, cannot be written about in the lexicon, in the vocabulary in which I have been writing about, or we have been writing about our own life. So all these people together made me question my own uncertainties, own certitudes.
So it was a rediscovery of yourself in a way.
Rediscovery of life around me, rediscovery of India that remains beyond us, beyond me, and end of certitudes, I would say.
Right. So let me read a couple of lines from, I think it's perhaps the first chapter, and this is a policeman that we are talking about. You don't give his name, and he's talking about how he deals or fights the Maoists on the ground. And this man says, war is not fought on a battlefield. It is fought on the chessboard of your mind. What do you think he means?
What he means is that the war in Bastar is not just about rifles and bullets. So he has to launch a psychological battle within the Naxal camp. How does he do it? He tries to manipulate the Adivasis, the media, as well as the state and the civil society. And without doing that, and all of this does not entail weapons. Without doing that, he wouldn't be able to infiltrate the Maoist ranks. That's what he's suggesting here, proposing here.
Right. And then there is another line which is very eloquent, I thought, when you say life is awfully cheap in Bastar.
Yes, that's true.
In what way?
Because when you go to the jungle, you are not certain about your return. And this is not true only of the police forces, security forces who go to the jungle, or the Maoists who are fighting the battles. Even for journalists, neutral, objective journalists like us, even they are somehow doubtful about it. So one has to risk a lot of things, including death, when they go to the jungle. That's what Bastar is all about.
But it's not just about outsiders or journalists. It's about the story of Bastar itself, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's why I said both the police as well as the Maoists who are fighting the battle. By the Maoists, I meant the Adivasis guerrillas. They are also aware of it. Even the local Adivasis, for instance, several Adivasis are killed on the accusation of being an informer, mukhbir, by the Maoists in Jan Adalats without any fault of theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, life is, when he says the life is awfully cheap, he actually refers to all the sides. Of course, it's not just about the security forces and the Maoists. Whosoever is living in Bastar, they live with a perpetual fear in interior jungle. I mean, that death is somewhat chasing them all the time.
Tell us about the story of this young girl, or one of the young girls that you talk about in the book, who was shot. And again, it's a conversation with the deceased. And her father says, first they told us that she was killed in the middle of the night. And now they say that she's a whore. What do you think the family must go through?
She was a young girl of 15. She lived in a village where the Indian state is yet to provide electricity. And she was found dead some few kilometers of her home, somewhere in the wilderness. And the postmortem report revealed, as I have written, that she was which is one of the most horrific postmortem reports I have ever read in my life. The report read, having dilated vagina, habitual about sex. I have never seen any postmortem report that is commenting on the suspected sexual behavior, which is utterly untrue of a 15-year-old girl. So this girl then dies, and then the then home minister, who was also a tribal Adivasi, he then tries to defame her, saying, "Itni raat ko kahan se aa rahi thi aakhir wo?" So when the policemen were accused of rape, he tried to defend it. I mean, the home minister defend his policeman. "Itni raat ko kahan se aa rahi thi?" And have you not read her postmortem report? What does it say? It already reveals everything. So this is one of the most horrific stories that I've ever seen. First you rape, then you kill, and then you insert utterly evil words in a postmortem report so that the state can conveniently build a narrative around it. So when I was writing it, I thought, let the girl speak her story on her own, in her own voice.
Mm.
So that's how it came about. She starts narrating her own story.
And what about her father? You know, how would her parents, what would they have said when they bring their daughter's body home? I mean, I cannot even believe what a parent must go through, is that, you know, you see your young child lying in front of you and all kinds of people are saying all kinds of things about her.
They were crestfallen, obviously. When I had met them then in August, September 2011, they were shocked that you first rape her, you kill her, and now you are calling her a slut. The state is calling her a slut. They were devastated completely, the family, including a young sister.
So did you, as a journalist, ask questions about why, you know, a postmortem report could have something like this?
Of course, I confronted the doctors, the state, the home minister, but you know the limits of the journalist. They can only ask questions. They can only write about it. Ultimately, the state is all too mighty.
So what did they say? What answers did you get?
About this particular case, the doctor said the doctor stood by his report. The doctor said I had to record it. That's it.
And he would use words like that habituated with sexual intercourse.
He actually wrote it in the postmortem report. And if you read the postmortem report, these words are actually added late. It's not in the running sentence. They're added with an asterisk mark later on. Suppose this is the script, and if you add a few words here, addenda, it's very visible. So those 7 words were not part of the original report, original handwriting. They were added later on.
By him, by the doctor.
Who else?
So he defends himself. He was defending himself.
He was defending himself, as I have written. He said that I have also videographed the entire postmortem. That is also there with me.
So this is, I mean, the tragedies of Bastar keep unfolding chapter by chapter in your book, and there's really no end to it. And it just makes you wonder, how is it that we don't even see that something like this is happening in the heart of India, and it's completely invisible to our eyes?
I think it's because the Adivasis somehow do not form a part of our political and national consciousness. In the last 3 or 4 decades, the Dalits have been able to assert their identity. We are increasingly recognizing Dalit as a powerful political class, but Adivasis continue to remain beyond the margins of our national state. Therefore, they do not form any political agenda. Therefore, it is very easy for the state, even a large section of the media, to continue to remain indifferent towards it. That's why I have written again and again in this book that it is for us, I mean people who believe that they carry a duty to address the pressing concerns of this country, that what have we done to address the concerns of the Adivasi?
But you hear about this, Ashutosh, and Schedule 5 and Schedule 6 of the Indian Constitution, which gives not just reservation from the time of independence to the scheduled castes, but also to the scheduled tribes, right? The 22.5% reservation that's given. So wasn't that the state since 1950, since the Constitution came into being, an attempt on the part of the state or on the part of the government for reparation, to say that people like the Adivasis and scheduled castes or Dalits had been subjected or subjugated over the centuries. So you have to sort of bring them back into the mainstream.
Jyoti, our constitution has wonderful provisions, no doubt about it. The question is this, how these constitutional provisions are being implemented on the ground. For instance, you just spoke about Schedule 6. There has been a long-standing demand to grant Bastar the Schedule 6 status. Why have not been able to? If Bastar is predominant.
Like the Northeast.
Sorry?
I said like the Northeast.
Yeah, like the Northeast, exactly. That's what I was coming to. Why have we not been able to? I give you one more instance when you said about Schedule 5. In other parts of Chhattisgarh, non-Bastar parts, during the government of Raman Singh, the state wanted to acquire some land for a coal plant. The Gram Sabhas there, for several years, consistently, one after another Gram Sabha meeting, over 10 or 12 Gram Sabha meetings, denied that we do not want this plant. Now, according to these provisions, if a Gram Sabha denies a plant, denies an entry of any project, this should not be done, right? And the Gram Sabha is doing it over a period of several years. What does the state do? The state, by an exceptional act of deception and fraud, the state converts that area from Gram Sabha to Nagar Panchayat, from Gram Panchayat to Nagar Panchayat. So now the area has come under the purview of the Nagar Panchayat. The state can easily bypass their voice and acquire the land, which is absolute fraud on the people. Would it not cause dissent then?
And you're saying that the political class is complicit.
Because this, as the example which I just gave you, it was done under the protection of the state government only, the BJP government. If they know that their Gram Sabha is consistently denying an entry to a particular project, how can they rename that area from Gram Sabha, convert that area from Gram Sabha to Gram Panchayat, to Nagar Panchayat? This is fraud. This is constitutional fraud.
But when politicians themselves are being killed, I mean, and I'm talking about the killing of senior Congress politician Vidya Charan Shukla, and a lot of others, Mahendra Karma, and several other people in that convoy. So when the political class is itself being attacked, not just being attacked, but by being killed, surely they would have a stake in resolving these issues.
You are absolutely right. And that baffles me as well. If their own leaders are being killed, why do not they take concrete, credible steps? Why do not they make a proper plan, roadmap to address this issue? Where is the issue? For instance, take the Narendra Modi government. We were told that they are very hard on such insurgents and extremists. But what is their game plan? Have they told us? Have we heard of any initiative they had taken to address this issue? Have they reached out to this Maoist? Have they tried to bring them to the negotiating table? Take the case of Chhattisgarh, Bhupesh Baghel government. This government, the Congress government, has lost 3 of its most senior leaders just a few years before. Mahendra Karma, VC Shukla you just named, Anand Kumar Patel, their state president, who remains the only state president to be killed in the Maoist violence. What have they done? What is the Bhupesh Baghel government doing? Why can't they invite them for negotiation, for talks? We don't see any initiative from them. That's what baffles me. That it seems that the political class believes that one fine day they will vanish on their own. Where even now, as many as 90 districts all over the country, not just in Bastar, from Kerala to say to Bihar and Jharkhand, they are, by this home ministry, they are being officially designated as left-wing extremism affected districts. What is the plan other than deploying more forces?
So you must have met a lot of Maoists in your reporting assignments.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And how would you explain what they do? The use of violence, of such unmitigated brutality.
Well, they somehow believe that the Indian parliamentary democracy is unjust towards a large section of people, that is the depressed and the marginalized. So they believe that only through a violent overthrow of the system they can introduce a government for the people. This is what their ideology is all about. But the way they conduct this violence, that's actually reprehensible, that's morally, strategically indefensible.
In what way?
Like the killing of Mahindra Karma. That was such a brutal, barbaric killing. This shows that, see, any revolutionary, if they really want to introduce a just and equitable government, they cannot afford to kill their suspected enemies or alleged enemies in such brutal manners.
What did they do?
Well, they stabbed him multiple times. His body has some 70 plus wounds, and then they stormed over his body. They stabbed him and they shot him and they hacked him here and there. This was a very brutal killing. Even after killing him, they danced over his body.
And how do you know that? Did they take a video? Did you see a video?
I have seen several other videos, not this particular video. I have seen several ambush videos, but then they came out with several reports about this killing.
And when they do all this, they dance over the body. What is it for? Is it to, is it to tell other Maoists or younger people and to exhort them to do the same?
Well, I had discussions with them. Like for instance, they shoot several ambush videos. And then in their camps, they play these ambush videos for younger guerrillas. So I asked them that why do you have to play such videos of violence and blood, such horrific videos to your younger cadets? So their answer has been that is how we are able to inculcate in them a hatred towards the enemy and a confidence that they can deal with this mighty enemy. This has been their argument.
And do you see any girls or women in these Maoist camps?
Oh yes, women constitute some 40% of the armed cadre of the Maoist in Dandakaranya. Without such an overwhelming support of women cadres, this insurgency would not have sustained for so long.
But why are the women there at all in the first place? I mean, what attracts them?
Number one, they believe that in the Maoist fold, they may be able to get greater equality than they have outside, which outside in the means in their community, which to some extent is true as well. The Maoists, despite committing several ills, at least they have been able to give a lot of their women cadres a lot of dignity and self-respect within their organization. That is one of the which we need to give them this credit. Also, when a large number of people from your area is joining the battle of Jal, Jungle and Bameen, so there is a very little difference between men and the women cadres, Adivasi cadres. They all join in bulk. Here, let me just point out one interesting thing, one very interesting contrast, in fact. In the last 30 or 40 years of the Kashmir militancy, we perhaps do not have even one single armed woman cadre in any of the groups, at least I do not know of. Whereas in Dandakaranya, 40% are armed women cadres.
So are they just sort of wives of male cadres, or do they also carry guns? Do they have children? I mean, how does it work?
They of course carry guns, and they are spouses also, but they do not have children, because children, that is procreation, is banned in Abushmal, in entire Dandakaranya, entire CPI Maoist ranks, because they believe that procreation is not conducive to the goals of revolution. If you have children, you may not be able to carry out ambushes and attacks.
Who believes this?
Sorry?
Who believes this?
This is the rule book of the CPI Maoist.
Mm-hmm.
So there are marriages, but these marriages they strictly conform to quote unquote rules of requirements of revolution, and to ensure that they do not have children, they rarely spend time together. Even when they do, the Maoists ensure that almost all the male cadres, they undergo vasectomy. I have written about that as well.
the leaders of the CPI Maoists, are they very much part of the fight inside the jungle, or are they sitting in cities like Khammam and Warangal and Bijapur, fighting the fight from a distance, and fighting on the ground is being done by the cadres?
Senior leaders, they're also very much part of the fight.
Hmm.
They're also based in Abujmar, various parts of Bastar here and there. They, of course, may not participate because of their failing health or, say, age, may not participate in direct ambushes, but they are very much in the jungle. It's not that they are directing the struggle, directing the fight from some distance. They're very much there.
So the story that you're painting is, Ashutosh, of this area in the heart of India, which is in a sense seceded from the country.
Yeah, that is true. A large part of area in Dandakaranya that is beyond the writ of the Indian state. These are the areas which are effectively liberated. But these are the areas where representatives of the state, except a few occasional health workers or some teachers here and there, nobody visits there. Nobody can visit there. So these areas are very much under the guerrillas' control. Forget about common citizen, yeah.
And how do they attract people to the fold? How do they make new cadres?
See, let me explain it in a bit detail here.
Yeah.
This insurgency is now in its 6th decade. If we say that, if we take the formal date of its beginning, the day when the Naxalbari movement began in 1967, we are now in its 6th decade.
Right.
And it is now spread almost all over country. We know that as well. So if we have such a large spread over such a long period of time, obviously it is not a localized insurgency. We need to understand it is an ideological fight. It is on the basis of this ideology, the ultra-left ideology, that only through an armed revolution they can bring a just and equitable government. It is through ideology they are able to attract large number of cadres, be it in Adivasi fold or in urban cities. That is it. In the Adivasi area, there's a particular distinction, the subtle distinction as well. That is, a large number of Adivasis do not always understand the complexities or nuances of the revolutionary thought. That is either the Marxist thought or the Maoist or the Leninist thought. For them, it's a mere fight to save their Jal, Jungle or Jameen. That is land, forest and water. To a large number of Adivasi guerrillas then, the fight is a very localized fight to save their immediate habitat. And through these slogans, through this ideological and awareness and raising this threat that the state is coming to you, the Maoists are able to attract others.
But if the Maoists want to kill the capitalists who I imagine is what they're ideologically fighting, then they should just kill capitalists. If, I mean, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, because violence is in any case is a violation of the constitution. If you want to do anything, you have to do it without arms. But if they have a problem with capitalists, they should just address that. Why kill ordinary innocent people?
Well, that is among the inner contradictions of the Maoist party. So for instance, we have seen that a few major mining plants of big mining companies, they have come up in Dantewada and somehow they have gone unscathed. Why? Because the police tell us later on that the Maoists had a secret understanding, about which I have written in my book, with some of these groups and companies. They would give them extortion, and the Maoists will relatively keep themselves away from that.
You've also written about the Salwa Judum in your book. Tell us first what this is, and tell us the story of Salwa Judum and how this has unfolded into being a clash between citizens.
Salwa Judum was, as we know, initiated by under the leadership of Mahendra Karma, who was then an eminent Congress leader, with full support of the then BJP government, Raman Singh's government, as well as the UPA government. So Salva Judum was a movement, where the state gave weapons to its own people in an utterly unconstitutional, unauthorized manner to go against people the state considered its enemy. And we know that from 2005 to 2007, around 2 years, the time that Salva Judum remained in Bastar, those were not only the bloodied years of this struggle, but also these were the years when the Maoists could get maximum retreatment. Because when you give arms, when the state gives arms to young people, young Adivasis, the boys of 18 or 19 or 17, and then they start committing atrocities, then the backlash then that happened from the Maoist side, that was immense. The Maoists were able to bring together a large number of Adivasis by raising this fear that, look, we have told you, the state is coming after you. The Salva Judum was a huge failure, and I believe that to make Bastar the capital or the undisputed capital of the Maoist insurgency, Salva Judum has had a major role to play.
You also say in your book that Bastar became a place where both the ultra-left as well as the right-wing, so yes, both the CPI Maoist as well as the BJP and the RSS, both found a meeting ground. Can you explain a little bit about that?
See, this is yet another ironies of our political system. I just told you about Mahendra Karma. He was from Dantewada. In 2008 election, Maoists helped BJP to defeat Mahendra Karma. And this, in fact, was later established in police investigation as well.
How did they do that? And how did the Maoists get in touch with the BJP? Or how did the BJP get in touch with the Maoists?
See, we need to understand that the BJP and the Maoists, the leaders in Bastar, in large parts of Bastar, they're all Adivasis. And most of them have shared same villages, same schools also. They have been, they are relatives as well. So it is not difficult for them to come together on a common platform. So so far, we have evidence of at least 2 elections. I'm talking about elections. At least 2 elections in which, this is not my evidence, this is the evidence of the Indian police, Bastar police, that was then working under the BJP government. So the police working under the BJP government found evidence that in at least 2 elections, the Maoist helped BJP and the BJP sought the help of the Maoist.
Which 2 elections?
Sorry?
Which 2 elections?
One is 2008 Dantewada assembly election when Mahendra Karma was defeated. That was the first ever election in which BJP could secure its victory in Dantewada. Consider the irony. In 2008, BJP makes its debut in Dantewada, and a few years later, we come to know that it was as a Maoist leader who had been helping the BJP candidate in that election. This was one election. Another election was 2001 Lok Sabha Bastar's by-election. We have people on
2001.
2011.
Sorry. Okay.
We have people on record saying it. And besides that, there have been contractors, middlemen who operate in Bastar, who have given statements to the police, once again under the BJP government, saying that they had been providing material support to the Maoists. They were acting as middlemen between the Maoist and the BJP.
Right.
So we have sufficient evidence for it. That's why I wrote that this is a curious region where the right wing as well as the ultra-left and ultra-right, they grew together.
So as they say in the Hindi heartland, Hammam mein sab nange hain. So nobody had any compunctions. Nobody was averse to shaking hands, to getting support from each other, even though they publicly hate each other.
True.
So a couple of last questions, Ashutosh. You speak very eloquently, or you write very eloquently about the Abuj Marg in your book. Tell us a little bit about this space.
It's a mysterious land, and the state data tells us that the state started mapping it only in 2017. I give you some instance. In 2012, the CRPF made its first ever entry into Abujamar. They had planned it thoroughly. They knew that they would come across a wilderness they had no idea about. They also knew that this is the home of some of the senior-most Maoists. As a part of their preparation, they were armed with satellite images, Google Maps and all. But when they went inside, they found out that what had appeared on satellite images and Google Maps as Naxal bunkers, they were actually scaffoldings for animals. They were actually small herds. Several coordinates, the coordinates of several villages, which are available in state's archives, they were either non-existent or they were far off the actual coordinates. So the state did not even know that what is actually inside a Bujmar. So I can give you a bit of personal thing as well. So I made innumerable trips to a Bujmar. So whenever I would come back, senior cops would tell me, would call me and say, अच्छा ये बताओ यार वहाँ क्या क्या है, वहाँ नदी कौन सी है, वहाँ क्या है, what is there, which rocks do you see there, how many trees, what kind of trees are there. So the Indian state doesn't, it's a mythical land for the Indian state.
They had never been, or many of them had never been.
Exactly.
I think it's a story of so many tragedies of these surrendered Maoists. So, my last question is about these Gopaniya cadres, the informers. People who are sort of stuck between the police and their own people, or the villagers or the Maoists. Tell me a little bit about that.
This is among the most treacherous tales of the entire death script. The Adivasi is forced to become an informer. The Adivasi who had been dwelling in their jungle, having mahua and occasional chicken, they are now forced to rat on both the sides. And look at the term Gopaniya Sainik. How does it evolve? The surrendered Naxals who joined the police, who were forced to join the police sent them back to the front by adding this tag called Gopaniya Sainik, that is Mukhbir. So Mukhbir is a little bit derogatory, therefore they have given a slightly Sanskritized or more urbanized word called Gopaniya Sainik. And we know that how the number of Gopaniya Sainiks that are killed by the Maoists every year.
So this is the treachery of this land, where people are just not fighting with each other, but also against each other in a sense, would you say?
Yeah, that is true. That's why I have written, this is the Kurukshetra of independent India. One brother is fighting against the other brother. And you are in great dilemma. The crippling doubts that Arjuna had faced, you are facing them. So what do we do now?
I think that's a question that that so many decades of Indian politicians, of the ruling class in Delhi, in the center and in the states, have tried to answer, have failed to answer. But thank you so much, Ashutosh, for this book. Hopefully it will encourage people to read it and to search for some of the answers that you have posed as questions in your book. I just want to remind our viewers that this is an online collaboration between the print and HarperCollins. It's called Soft Cover, and we are very pleased and very proud that Ashutosh Bharadwaj, a former colleague, a fellow journalist, is now the subject of this book launch and the author of this book. Ashutosh, congratulations again, and we hope many people buy your book. And please do subscribe to the Prince YouTube channel. Read us, tell us what you think, and all the best for your book.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. It was wonderful to have this conversation with you, former colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you.